Part 2. Theater of the Era of the Emergence of Bourgeois Relations. Introduction. The epoch, called the Renaissance, was the time of the disintegration of the old, feudal formation and the laying of the foundations of a new, capitalistic one. It was the time of formation of the European bourgeois nations within larger nation-states, the period of weakening of the dictatorship and the victory of the church, free-thinking cheerful. F. Engels, Dialectics of Nature, Gospodarstdat, 1952, p. 4. It was the greatest progressive revolution of all the experienced up to that time humanity. Ibid. This coup was carried out in all areas of public life, in economics, politics, science, philosophy, literature and art. The human thought developed with extraordinary courage, revealing one by one the mysteries that surrounded nature. Dawn of the Renaissance flashed the first rays in Italy and gradually illuminated all the Western European countries. Dante, Petrarca, Boccaccio, Leonardo da Vinci, Giordano Bruno, Michelangelo, Galileo, Raphael, Rubens, Cervantes, Lope de Vega, Rabelais, Bacon. Shakespeare as truly geniuses, the titans of science and art generated by this era. The coup in Europe in the middle of the 16th century was a consequence of the long process of development of the productive forces, a process that was taking place slowly and gradually, when elements of a new, capitalist way began to emerge within the old feudal relations of production. The time, which in the history of culture is called the Renaissance, in the socio-economic area is called the period of the initial accumulation of capital. The process of initial capitalist accumulation expressed itself in the expropriation of the means and tools of production among the working masses of the city and countryside. In the cities, in connection with the development of a large manufacturing industry, small producers turned into wage workers, and in villages the growth of large land ownership was accomplished through the predatory capture of communal lands and the almost total delanding of peasants who became farm laborers or pauper tramps. Characterizing these processes, K. Marx wrote in Capital, "The economic structure of capitalist society grew out of the economic structure of feudal society. The decomposition of the latter liberated the elements of the first, thus, the historical process that turns producers into hired workers, on the one hand, as their liberation from feudal duties and guild coercion, but, on the other hand, those released only become sellers of themselves when they have taken away all their means of production and all guarantees existence, provided by old feudal institutions." K. Marx, Capital, Volume I, Gospodarstdat, 1951, p. 719. The second source of the initial accumulation was the robbery of the colonies and the legalization of piracy by the state on the seas. The discovery of gold and silver mines in America, poverty, enslavement and burial alive in the minds of the indigenous population, the first steps towards the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the hunting field on black, this was the dawn era of capitalist production. Ibid, p. 754. Finally, the secularization of ecclesiastical lands and the confiscation of church property were the third source of wealth accumulation in the hands of a new class. In this respect, the Reformation served as the beginning of a whole series of phenomena that accelerated the process of the formation of capitalist systems. The new ecclesiastical institutions, which severed the connection between the state and the papal throne, led to the theft of church property and the expropriation of a large mass of monastic peasants. The destruction of the monasteries turned the inhabitants into the proletariat. The church estates themselves were largely given as gifts to predatory royal favorites or sold for nothing to speculators, farmers and townspeople who massively drove their old hereditary tenants from them and united the economies of the latter. K. Marx, Capital, Volume I, Gospodarstdat, 1951, p. 725. The formation of a mass of working people deprived of the means of production opened a new and most powerful source of enrichment for the bourgeoisie and exploitation of the working people unprecedented in their cruelty. The appearance of a large number of deck-class people gave cheap workers' hands to entrepreneurs, and the state, now already patronizing the bourgeoisie, created legislation that, by means of bloody repressions, forced the dispossessed workers to go to work in the city, to the entrepreneur to open manufactories in the city, or to the landowner in the village for the most meager price. That was the downside of the greatest progressive revolution, time, inscribed in the annals of human language, flaming sword and fire. IBID, p. 720. Appreciating this period in the history of mankind, pointing out that, only now, in fact, the earth was discovered, the spiritual dictatorship of the Church has been broken, and the unprecedented flowering of art and scientific research of nature, the classics of Marxism at the same time with anger and disgust noted that, the newborn capital exudes the blood and dirt from every pore from head to toe. F. Engels, Dialectics of Nature, Gospodarstdat, 1952, p. 3. K. Marx, Capital, Volume I, p. 764. The New World was born in the conditions of a general revolution, in the vanguard of which the bourgeoisie was, but the stronghold, the real and all-destroying force of this movement was the people, the poor in towns and peasants in villages, who defended their human rights and civil liberties in battles. Jacquerie in France, 1358, the Ciompi movement in Italy, 1378, the Hussite Wars in the Czech Republic, 1369–1415, the uprising of Wat Tyler, 1381, and Jack Kidd, 1450, in England, the Catalan uprising in Spain, 1462, the Great Peasant of War in Germany, 1525. These popular revolutions shook the foundations of feudalism. Thus, the two forces, the people and the bourgeoisie, acting jointly in their struggle against feudalism, participating jointly in the accomplishment of the greatest progressive coup, at the same time expressed various aspects of this process. The dialectics of the historical process consisted in the fact that these various aspects of the Renaissance, the people's liberation and bourgeois cumulative, were ideologically embodied in a system of views that, in common terms, had sharply opposite aspirations. Speaking against feudal slavery, proclaiming the ideas of freedom and equality, the ideals of reason and justice, the people practically expressed their protest against the division of society into masters and slaves. The German Peasant War, writes Engels, prophetically pointed to the impending class struggles, for not only the insurgent peasants appeared on the arena, there was nothing new in it, but behind them appeared the predecessors of the modern proletariat with a red flag in their hands and with the requirement of community of property on the lips. F. Engels, Dialectics of Nature, Gospodarstdat, 1952, p. 3. But the ideas put forward by the people in this struggle were often concluded in the form of Christian commandments or patriarchal laws. A new worldview needed more definite ideological attitudes, in a more precise, rational form. The presence of a community of anti-feudal aspirations of the bourgeoisie and the democratic masses of the people made the bourgeoisie an active participant in the creation of a new, progressive ideology. The bourgeoisie played a revolutionary role in history. But, pursuing class-specific goals, the bourgeoisie, naturally, had to work out both a purely class ideology, an ideology of naked interest and heartless purity, and this left a clear imprint on the culture of the Renaissance, gave it a dual character. The contradictions of this culture were thus determined by the bilateral meaning of the coup itself, which, while expressing the people's struggle against feudalism, remained a bourgeois overturn, limiting its historical goal to a change in one form of exploitation of another, replacing the feudal production relations by capitalist ones. The bourgeoisie, fighting the feudal lords, willingly supported popular uprisings. The historical meaning of this alliance was that the peasant movements, undermining the feudal system and strengthening bourgeois relations, contributed to the strengthening of cities and imperceptibly prepared for themselves a new, no less cruel master. If the peasant uprisings contributed to the victory of the bourgeoisie, then the betrayals of cities were the permanent and principal causes of the death of peasant revolutions. The bourgeoisie jealously followed the course of plebeian uprisings, and in all cases when the popular movement went beyond the struggle against feudal foundations and threatened to grow into a social revolution, betrayed the people. The era of the progressive coup brought the immediate victory of the bourgeoisie. The masses of the people were deceived and reinterpreted with even greater force. But in those years when the bourgeoisie together with the people was going to storm feudalism, liberation, humanistic ideas were developed that inspired the best ideologists of humanism and served for the people themselves as the source of an undying faith in themselves, the impetus for the unyielding striving to fight and conquer public evil. The most important idea of the great humanists was the idea of man as the master of his destiny, independent of divine arbitrariness, living his own mind, his own passions and will. Such a rational and active man was sharply opposed to a medieval man. The new man was the product of a new way of life. Naturally, at the center of the new ideology was the image of a man free in his thoughts, in his faith, in his feelings and passions, possessing all the knowledge of his time, the man to whom the humanist Pico della Mirandola sang an enthusiastic hymn in the speech on the dignity of man, proclaiming him godlike, and Shakespeare, through Hamlet's lips, declared, the beauty of the universe, the crown of all living things. The place of the ascetic and fanatic in the public consciousness was taken by the personality of a strong, free and reasonable person. In this victory of that humanistic ideal over the church was a fact of immense historical significance. But the cult of strong individuality contained not only a progressive meaning. Here lies the justification of stale egoism, predatory greed, the justification of any means for achieving personal goals, personal gain. The idealization of a strong personality with power was also conditioned by the fact that the bourgeoisie was interested in the royal power, which could ensure its unimpeded enrichment. Already Dante, 1265-1321, saw the growing role of monetary calculation in public life and condemned it, calling it greed. But in 100 years, bourgeois ideologists will declare economic what Dante condemned, and will, as L.B. Alberti, 1407-1472 did, idolize greed, considering it the foundation of a well-organized society. Still later, Machiavelli, 1469-1521, will create a theory that justifies the behavior of a person whose aspirations are based only on personal interest and which uses any means to achieve power. This is how the materialist conception of the world, the triumph of a strong human individuality, will assimilate to itself the bourgeoisie. The idea of freedom was equally ambiguous. Its progressive meaning was enormous. Born of the people in the fight against feudalism, the idea of freedom occupied a central place in the ideology of the Renaissance. If the feudal estate was a stronghold of serfdom, then the bourgeois city, although it was in the system of feudal relations, was the birthplace and prosperity of liberties. A person who has lived in the city for more than a year, even if he was the last serf, became free. The feudal order deprived man of the freedom of action and freedom of thought. Therefore, the struggle for freedom combined the political and ideological struggle and united the bourgeoisie with the serf peasantry. The struggle for personal freedom was the struggle against serfdom in the countryside and with the aristocratic self-will in the city. Humanists, people of a new culture, felt the idea of freedom as the main symbol of their time, as the most precious acquisition of man, which frees him from the past oppression and enables him to assert his own personality. No one at that time expressed this thought better than Cervantes. He puts the following words in the mouth of Don Quixote: "Freedom, Sancho, this is the greatest blessing granted to the sky by mankind, with the most precious treasures hidden in the depths of the earth and in the depths of the seas are not equaled. And, on the contrary, slavery is the greatest misfortune that can befall a person." In the field of political freedom, very early, in Italy of the 14th century, it began to oppose tyranny, a system of political enslavement. Already in Boccaccio we find beautiful, full of civic pathos, "There is no sacrifice more pleasing to God than the blood of a tyrant." But the idea of freedom during the initial accumulation had a completely different, cynical and rude side. It turned for the entrepreneur and the colonialist into the right to trample on all moral and legal regulations, into an unlimited, unrestrained right of profit. Describing this freedom, Marx and Engels wrote in the Manifesto of the Communist Party: "The bourgeoisie, wherever it has achieved domination, destroyed all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. Ruthlessly she tore up the motley feudal bonds that tied the man to his natural overlords, and she did not leave any other connection between people other than naked interest, a heartless claim. In the icy water of selfish calculation, she shed the sacred thrill of religious ecstasy, chivalrous enthusiasm, Philistine sentimentality. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value, and in place of the numberless indefeasible freedoms single, unconscionable freedom of trade." So at that time, the other side of it was the idea of freedom. K. Marx and F. Engels, Manifesto of the Communist Party, Gospodarstat, 1952, p. 35. The third greatest achievement of the Renaissance culture was the materialistic perception of nature, which Engels called the discovery of the earth.